Hello, everyone. Hello, my name is Ken McKenzie. I'm head of the Department of Economics. I'd like to welcome you all here to our 2015 Distinguished Speaker Lecture, or Distinguished Lecture Speaker, or whatever you prefer. It works either way. I'll only take a few minutes and then we'll get things going. I just wanted to sort of remind everybody here what this series is all about. The whole idea behind this series is to bring in distinguished speakers in the area of economics to present his or her research to a broader university community and city community as well, if you will. So with a primary emphasis on the undergraduates, to try to sort of expose you to some of the really path-breaking work that's going on in a lot of the economics profession. And this is the 7th lecture in the series. Our first started in 2009 with our inaugural lecture by Gene Grossman from Princeton University. This was followed by Tim Besley from LSE, Larry Samuelson from Yale, Frederick Mishkin from Columbia, Janet Curry from Princeton, and then last year Larry Goulder from Stanford. This is clearly a very distinguished list of speakers and tells you a little bit about the reach of the economics department here at the University of Calgary as well, which I think is very important. And I think this year's speaker, John List from the University of Chicago, is yet another very impressive addition to this already very distinguished list, and we're very happy to have him here to tell you a little bit about how field experiments can change the world. That's a pretty big order, and I'm sure if anybody can live up to that, it's John. I'm going to introduce to you now my colleagues, Subhashish Dugar, who's going to introduce John more fully, and I hope you enjoy the lecture. I'll see you at the end. So, Sub.
Okay, thanks everybody for coming. So it's a great honor for me to introduce John List. I first met him when I was a graduate student. John List is Homer J. Livingston Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago. So John is absolutely brilliant. John has pioneered the use of field experiments in economics. And in recognition of his work, in 2012, he received the prestigious Uriah Johnson Prize in economics, and 9 of the previous 20 recipients of this prize have gone on to win the Nobel Prize in economics. So, in other words, John actually doesn't need this from me. John received his PhD from the University of Wyoming in 1996. So he has been out of grad school for 18 years, and he has published 174 papers, many of which are published in top 5 economics journals. By the way, you have to check. As of last night, it was 174. It might have changed since last night. So basically, the number of papers will be actually a flawed parameter to measure John's contribution in economics. The kind of questions he has asked and the kind of places he has traveled to, his research has taken him to, is impressive. So let me give you a few examples of that. John has visited sports cars market, perhaps his most favorite, to understand the causes behind discrimination on the ground. John also has knocked on the door of Americans many times just to understand the way why people vote and why people make charitable donations. John has traveled to Chinese factories in Hong Kong to understand how bonuses, when they are framed as gains or losses, how it can affect worker productivity. John has traveled to remotest parts in India and Tanzania in order to understand how societal factors might shape up men and women's preference for competitiveness. John has also visited Sierra Leone to understand how sustainable forest use is affected by monetary incentives. So as you can imagine, John is a very well-traveled man. Apart from this, if you just look at John's research, it has informed theorists, it has maintained a constant dialogue with the community, and at the same time, it has basically whispered to the ears of the queen, that's policymakers. right? In spite of doing all of these things, John actually still finds enough time to play baseball with his 5 kids. So without spending any more time, please join me in welcoming John List.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you. Well, that's high pressure, very high pressure. I want to start by saying, Scott, thanks for putting all this together in the Department of Economics. Thanks so much for having me. I was here about 6 years ago, and I thoroughly enjoyed my visit, so it's just wonderful to be back. Okay? Ray DeRentis, 14 years old. Antonio Fenner, 16 years old. Oscar Marquez, 17 years old. These are all people who were part of my field experiment on looking at teen shootings. In Chicago, 1 CPS student every day is shot in our streets. It's primarily a problem for young men. There is a problem for the other sex, however. It's this one. Now, when you look at data across countries, what you see are great countries like Canada and New Zealand actually leading the way in teen births per 1,000 women aged 15 to 19. It looks like about 2 to 2.5%. But there's really no comparison to the problem that we have in the States along the lines of teen births. As you can see here, we're over double and close to triple what you have here in Canada. If you want countries that are close on this metric to the States, you should look at countries like Rwanda and the Sudan. That's our peer group in the United States in relation to the teen birth problem we have. In Chicago, by the time African American and Hispanic girls reach their 19th birthdays, half of them have been pregnant at least once. What links those two very important social issues? First, we know very little about their causes, and we know less about solutions to these problems. Second, we can use economics and field experiments to help solve these types of problems. So let me give you a few summaries. For teen shootings, we put together an economic model that can predict which boys are highest at risk of getting shot on our streets. So what do we then do with that information? We go and create a program to try to stop these kids from teen violence. And what we find is that the best way to do it is to actually parachute someone in their lives. Simple pecuniary and non-pecuniary incentives will not work. What you need to do is fly in a father figure for 3 or 4 years from 15 to 19 and keep the boys off the streets. That's what works. For teen births, the exact same thing. We can put together a model that only has 2 or 3 variables that can predict which women are most likely to get pregnant during their teen years. Now, what happens here is you do not need someone to parachute into these women's lives. What you simply need is hope. You need to give these women hope for the future, and in turn, they will push back the time of the first birth. All of this with simple economics and field experiments. A problem for both boys and girls is public education. I'm going to focus on public education today. Okay? When you look at how economists think about empiricism, how do we do our empirical work? What you find is that we typically have an idea, we then run back to our office and write down a model. We then download mounds and mounds of data. What do? We beat up the data to say something causal. And then we call policymakers and say, this is what I have found. Here's what we found in the States. We need teachers with higher degrees, we need smaller sized classrooms, and we need to spend more money on public education. That comes from analyzing mounds and mounds of data. Okay? So have we done that? What I have here is a percentage of teachers with a master's degree or higher from 1961 to 2006. And as you can see, our teachers are getting trained more in the States. It's gone from about 23% to about 62%, those teachers with master's degrees. So check. We've done that. What about the student to teacher ratio? Again, from 1970, it's about 22.3, all the way down to about 15.6 to 1 today. So check. That ratio has gotten better. What about money? We have thrown money at this problem in the States. These are in real terms. It's gone from about $5,200 per student to about $12,100. We have thrown a ton of money at the problem as well. So the conventional wisdom should say we should have a lot better outcomes. Here's one way to measure outcomes. This is high school graduates is a ratio of 17-year-olds. What does that look like? Pretty flat, right? Pretty flat. So in terms of getting kids to graduate, all those resources do not seem to have worked. What about standardized test scores? What I have here are standardized test scores for 9-year-olds, 13-year-olds, and 17-year-olds over time. That exact same time period. What happens? They're flat. Houston, we have a problem. We've analyzed mounds and mounds of data. We thought it was causal. We've done it, and the results do not follow from what we have done. Now, you can sit back and say, well, wait, they don't have the proper counterfactual. That's my point with field experimentation. If you did these things experimentally, you would have the proper counterfactual. So what's the alternative? Of course, I'm going to say it's field experiments. So let's start talking about field experiments by asking, John, who are your subjects in your field experiments? Let me ask you a question. Please raise your hand if you have flown United Airlines in the past, say, 5 years. Please raise your hand very high if you've flown United over the last 5 years. Very good. Please raise your hand if you've bid in an eBay auction in the past 5 years. Please raise your hand. Okay, took out a few more. If you've given to a major charitable cause in the past decade, please raise your hand. Now, my research would suggest most of you are lying because you're just trying to send a signal to your neighbors about how great you are and how great your social preferences are. Especially the single people, they're lying even more. Please raise your hand if you have used a major search engine for retail purposes, Google, Yahoo, etc. Please raise your hand. Has anyone not raised their hand at least once? Okay. Right out this door, there's a therapist for you. You have to join the modern world. It's a great place to live. All of you but one have been my lab rats. All of you have helped me learn about economics in the wild, economics in the real world. All of you have given me data that helps me learn about how economics shapes and affects our choices. So I want to thank you guys all for that. I can't tell, you might be thinking, this is really weird. I can't tell your identity and how you behaved, so there is a little bit of okayness in that. Okay, so I cannot link each of you to an individual choice. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk a bit about education. And I think the fundamental problem, even though we've been doing public education in the States for over 100 years, is that we have used our schools primarily to teach our kids rather than teach ourselves. That ends up being a serious problem because if we don't use our schools to teach ourselves, every day we are foregoing an opportunity to learn about what works in education and why. And that has to be a fundamental revolution or transformation in education circles to have people think about when we change something, let's make sure we have the appropriate control group so we can learn about if we spend more money or if teachers receive higher educations or if classroom sizes are smaller. We need to fundamentally know whether those are truly causal impacts. And we don't because we have foregone feedback opportunities. So let's talk a little bit about my lab. I've been doing education field experiments for, say, the last 7 years. And my lab has been in a community called Chicago Heights. So I have Chicago Heights right down here, and it's a little bit hard with the lighting. But what I want to show here is this is Chicago. And Chicago many times is talked about as the great city of diversity. So what I have here is a quick glimpse for you. Every green dot is 100 white people. Every yellow dot is 100 Hispanic people. And every blue dot is 100 black people. It is diverse, but it's heavily segregated. The great diverse and segregated city. Now what Chicago Heights gives me is that same observable mix of income, wealth, and race is what the major metropolitan areas give me. So in that way, I have used Chicago Heights as a microcosm of what's going on in our urban settings across America. Denver Public Schools, California, DC, New York City, Atlanta, they all share these observable characteristics that we have in Chicago Heights and Chicago Public Schools. Now, why Chicago Heights? Well, when you look at our education problem, it's an urban school problem. It's quite simply an urban school problem. When you look at test scores, these kids who enter the 9th grade are typically reading and doing math at about the 3rd or 4th grade level. When you look at high school graduation rates, in my 2 high schools, we have 1,000 kids enter 9th grade every year, and about 470 make it out with a high school diploma. You have 53% attrition rate, and most of it happens between the 9th and 10th grades. Okay? So what we've been doing is this work that's been funded by a very large foundational grant to think about what exactly should we know about the education production function? What things should we tweak when it comes to administrators, families, teachers, kids themselves that are most cost effective? And which results have the longest duration? So I'm looking for results in particular that have long-run effects rather than just one test worth of effects. Okay, so where I'm going to start is teacher performance pay. I don't know, in Canada, is this a big issue, people talking about teacher performance pay? Okay, so in the US, this is one of the primary policy-making discussions around the US is whether we should shift teachers' pay to being more from fixed wage or an hourly rate to something based on the performance of their students. That's a constant debate in the US. So if you read the press in the US, it's pretty clear to them that merit pay does not work. Let me give you a few examples. Teacher performance pay alone does not raise student test scores. The long failed history of merit pay and how the Ed department ignores it. Why teacher performance pay won't work. $75 million teacher pay initiative did not improve achievement. An education reform without merit, performance pay doesn't work, so let's stop wasting money. So when I talk to teachers' unions, what they tell me is something very simple. They tell me teachers will never respond to merit pay incentives. They value the kids, not the money. Now, if that's true, this is a major economic finding that such a large group of people just ignore financial incentives, especially large financial incentives. So I was going to stop there and actually write this paper, just talking about I've just discovered 14% of America does not like money. But then I read an ABC News report that said teachers union endorses bonus plan not based on performance. So actually teachers do like money, they just don't want it linked to their own performance. Okay, so let's talk about the actual experiment that we ran in Chicago Heights. So the stakes that we're dealing with is that each teacher could earn over a year-long period $8,000. On average, a teacher will earn $4,000, which ends up being about 8% of their annual pay. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to start out by looking at a traditional bonus scheme. What's a traditional bonus scheme? You work all school year, and at the end of the school year, if your kids perform on standardized tests, we pay you the bonus. That's how 99.99% of bonuses in markets are typically paid. You work, and then you're paid at the end. Now we're going to cross that with something I call the clawback or the loss treatment. So here, when the school year starts, I am going to give each teacher in this treatment a check for $4,000. And they are told, you can do whatever you want with that money. Except at the end of the school year, if your kids do not perform, you might have to write us a check back because your kids did not perform. Okay, so it's essentially moving the payment from the back end to the front end. Most of our problems in society, we have to absorb a cost and then we get benefits later. So this is an idea along the lines of, let's take some of the benefits later and bring them to the present and see if we can change the way people behave. So if you think about the design, it's this simple. Field experiments are not hard. You have a group of teachers, and this is several hundred teachers over 2 years these data come from. You randomize them either into the control group, which these teachers have no incentive, business as usual, and you put some in the gain treatment and some in the clawback or loss treatment. Okay? So here's what happens. What I have here on the y-axis is standard deviation increases above the control. Okay, so this big bar right here, that's called the racial achievement gap. This is just to put my results into perspective. The racial achievement gap is this very nasty gap that we cannot get to disappear, the differences in test scores between minority and majority kids. And it's about 1/3 of a standard deviation, which ends up being thousands and thousands of dollars in the labor market if you take that out as a predictor of your labor market outcomes. So this first result here is that the gain treatment, it is doing a little bit better than the baseline, but it's not a very large effect and it's not significant. So all of those press clippings are correct. If you run a standard program, you will get a very small or zero effect. But if you put teachers into the clawback program, you will get a very, very large effect, and it's about 2/3 of the racial achievement gap in one school year. So let me be clear about what I'm saying. If your child is randomly placed in the classroom of a teacher who is given the clawback incentive, your son or daughter will go up by over 0.2 standard deviations above their control in terms of their value added over one school year. That ends up being somewhere around 2 standard deviations of teacher quality. Just simply because we have leveraged this idea that people do not like to give something up that they own. What Danny Kahneman called reference-dependent preferences or loss aversion. Leveraging a simple idea called loss aversion from psychology to make sure that this public policy is given the best chance of working. Now you might ask a question, can this simple idea work with students? Well, let's find out. What I've done here is this is a simple experiment with 8th and 10th graders, and these incentives are announced 5 minutes before they take the exam. Okay, so we have thousands and thousands of kids. They come into their classrooms to take their standardized exam. If you're in group 1, you are told, if you improve your test score from last fall, we will give you $1. Okay, that's it. 5 minutes before the test starts, and then they take the test. Group 2, they are told if you improve your test score, you will be paid $20 directly after the test. Group 3, we actually give them $20 and tell them if you do not improve your test score, we will take the $20 away after you take the test. And if you ever want to find out elements of the human body that you can never imagine studying, you should do a treatment like group 3 because people find very creative places to put $20. And then you have to fish it out of those places at the end of the experiment. Group 4, these are students in several classrooms that there's no announcement of an incentive. Okay? So let's see what happens here. What I have here now on the y-axis, these are not normed. These tests are not normed, so I have average improvement in grade levels. The baseline is 0, and as you can see, $1 does a little bit worse than the baseline. This is the idea that if you want to incentivize people with money, you should make sure to use a large enough incentive. And you can find this over and over again in different settings where you can actually crowd out effort if the incentives are not large enough. $20 gain is not that big either. But what is huge for these students is the threat of taking the $20 away. Now let me be clear, this is 5 minutes before the exam actually starts. This is not about prepping for 3 weeks to keep my $20. So you can say, what does this actually tell us about what standardized tests measure? Whenever we think about the racial achievement gap, we think it's a difference in, say, academic abilities or capabilities to do certain jobs. This tells me that it's a ton about simply effort. Simply effort the day of the test. That incentive scheme raises people's test scores by about 1/2 of a grade level. You can get the racial achievement gap to really get small if you take into account effort levels. Okay? Now, what is clear from those types of experiments, and if you want to see more of them, I can tell you several other stories about those kinds of experiments, but what is very clear is that when you approach a 7th grader, an 8th grader, a 9th grader, a 10th grader, it's really too late to make a major change in that student's life. You can't take a person who is reading at the 3rd grade level as a 9th grader and make that person a chemical engineer. What you can do is you can use incentives to make sure that person graduates high school and becomes a productive member of society. That's very important. But what you can't do is make that person into, let's say, a very productive member of the professional society. Very hard to do that. So that's what induces us to step back and say, if we want to make those kinds of changes, what should we do? What we did is we started our own pre-K program. Fully state licensed, accredited program that we have now been running for 4 years. We've just finished our 4th year. And in this program, I just want to talk for a few moments about this program. This is a program that touches 3, 4, and 5-year-olds in Chicago Heights. Okay, within this is one of our schools. As you can see, it says check at Chicago Heights Early Childhood Center on the sign. Now, what I want to talk a bit about is what we found in developing various curricula in this school and what we found about how far we can push these 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. So the overarching design, there are a ton of sub-treatments, but I'm just going to talk about the meta design here. So far, we've had over 3,000 kids sign up for our program. So kids sign up, and then we randomize them into different groupings. Group 1 is an all-day pre-K program. These kids come in, and they enjoy an all-day pre-K program that is free. And it's taught by our teachers who we have hired through the school district. We also have a parent academy. In these parent academies, we do not teach any of these kids directly. We teach their parents how to teach their kids. And then within the parent academy, we have a few sub-treatments too. We've combined those two in the last 2 years to look at an all-day pre-K program and a parent academy. And that's kind of the major treatment number 3. And in the control, we have 1,844 very unlucky kids who sign up for the program but do not receive any formal treatment from us. Of course, they can still sign up for other pre-K programs, but they do not receive a pre-K program from us. So what are some takeaways? So through these 4 years, we've tried different curricula, and we've used field experiments to try to develop the best possible curriculum we can. As far as I know, this is the first project that uses a large-scale number of people in various curricula and a field experimental approach to try to take the best elements of various non-COG programs. A non-COG program would be something like Literacy Express for those experts out there. In a COG program, a program that might push COG could be a little bit like Tools of the Mind that also focuses on executive function skills. Now, through that curriculum, what we found is that after 4 months in our program, the majority, more than 50% of our inner city kids actually score higher than the average American child in COG and non-COG test scores. After 4 months, I can move my kids from the south side of Chicago to the north side of Chicago. After that, it's really hard to get more gains. So 80, 90% of the gains from these programs come in the first 3 or 4 months, which is very important to know because now we can target programs that are not year-long, but are 3 or 4 months right before kindergarten starts. There's a very interesting and important group of kids, and they're Hispanics, where the parent academy works best. So with these kids, sending their parents to a parent academy actually is quite effective. And it's effective because it spills over to their siblings, and it spills over for years after the kids leave our program, which of course the all-day pre-K has a harder time doing that, and I'll talk about depreciation in a minute. So now what we have in place, our first cohort is actually in 4th grade right now. So what we have in place is a set of resources and the understanding of how to track these kids. So we will follow these kids over the entire life cycle. And we will figure out whether stamping them with non-COG skills was better than stamping them with COG skills, for example. We will figure out if early pre-K interventions help curb crime or teen bursts. We will be able to tell you about labor market outcomes. with people in our experiment and the control group. So I think what's coming here, you think about, well, what's out there that does this? Think about Perry Preschool. Anybody know the Perry program, or anybody in here, have you read about Perry? It's about 25 people in treatment, 27 in control, and it has about 10,000 sites because everyone keeps analyzing the same 52 data points. One of my colleagues, I think, probably has 1,000 of those papers. Okay, looking at Perry. And the same with abecedarian. Same thing, small sample, and they don't have the types of treatments. So that's where this particular research agenda is going. Now, I focused on education, and I read the advertisement for this talk, so I'm going to change gears and now dabble in a few other areas that might hold your interest. First question is, do women earn less money than men in labor markets? Let's look at some data. What I have here is a percentage gap between median men's and women's wages. Fraction here, so if you look at Korea, it's close to 40%. What that means is that the median man earns nearly 40% more in labor markets than the median woman. Now, these are unconditional in the sense that these are just raw data. Okay? Let's go ahead and go to one of my favorite countries, Canada. Canada's a little bit above, it's about 22%. The OECD average is 17.6. US is a little bit below that, about 19%. Now, for years, labor economists have asked the question, why is that the case? Why do women earn less than men? And you have different theories based on labor market attachment, different human capital. You have different jobs and sectors in the economy that men and women work in. After you control for those things, that average goes down to about 10%. So we have about 10% to explain in this equation. Where we have gone with our research is that there are just fundamental differences in preferences. And people in economics who were on this early are great scholars like Muriel Niederle from Stanford, Uri Gnesi, Aldo Rusticchini, who used lab experiments to explore whether women and men select into competitive environments differently. Okay, so their evidence would suggest that women like to compete much less than men. And we find similar evidence in the field. But what we also find is that there are certain situations that really don't involve competitiveness that might help us understand the gender pay gap. Let me tell you about an experiment that we've recently run on Craigslist. So we went to Craigslist and made a set of job advertisements across the entire US, across various cities in the US, announcing that we wanted to hire executive office assistants. In one ad, we explicitly say, pay is negotiable. In the other ad, we leave that sentence out. In the first ad, guess what happens? Women actually negotiated more than men. When they're told it's okay to negotiate, women will negotiate. But in the second one, when we made it ambiguous, when we took away that sentence, guess what happens? Women hardly negotiate at all. And guess what happens with men? They negotiate, some of them even harder. And it's correlated with their quality. So we had a third party look at all these CVs and rank the men and women based on quality. Of the men, the ones who negotiate the most in ambiguous situations are the lowest skilled men. That tells you something about men, I think. The low-skilled guys, the low-quality guys, those are the guys who are negotiating the hardest in ambiguous situations. Now, we've also taken some of this idea overseas and so kindly mentioned the work that is in India and in Africa, where we look at how people behave in simple experiments in matrilineal societies and how they behave in patriarchal societies. So very, very simple field experiments whereby we look at behaviors in the society called the Cassie Society. Has anyone ever heard of the Cassies? Please raise your hand if you've heard of the Cassies. A few people, so you can keep me honest here. So if you knock on the door of a Cassie family, the man will answer. He will then take you to the woman of the house. He will go sit in the corner while you talk to the woman of the house about issues of the day. All of a family's wealth runs through the youngest female in the family. If you have money to send one of your two kids to school, and one is a boy and one is a girl, you send the girl. The man goes and lives in the woman's house after the man and the woman get married. There are signs that men have placed around this society asking for equal rights. They want equal inheritance rights. So we do simple experiments there, and we compare it to very patriarchal societies like the Maasai tribe. Has anyone heard of the Maasai tribe? Okay, so these are the black-robed Maasai, not the red-robed. These are people who, when you ask them, what is your wealth? They will tell you 5 sheep, 20 head of cattle, 6 wives, and 3 dogs. You say, whoa, wait a second here. Yeah, that's what it is. Well, let's talk about wives. Well, right now I'm thinking about taking on 1 more wife, but I need 7 head of cattle to buy a wife. Women are treated like property. Despicable in the Maasai tribe. So we run experiments there too. What happens in the Maasai tribe is that their men and women act a lot like our men and women. Women of the Western world act a lot like women in the Maasai tribe. But when you look at the Cassie tribe, the matrilineal society, their women act like our men. Their men act like our women. And I think what that tells you is the power and importance of socialization and what society tells us we should be doing. And at this point, I always think about when I was in 3rd grade, if I was not trying hard in gym class, you can imagine what my gym teacher yelled to me. List, stop playing like a girl. And if the girl was dominating, it was, oh my goodness, isn't she a tomboy? Society from an early age tells us how we should be behaving. Discrimination. Why do people discriminate? Economists have 2 major models. Pagoo talked about 3rd-degree price discrimination. People discriminate to make money. That's Pagoo's story. That's called statistical discrimination. Gary Becker wrote a very different theory called a taste for discrimination in his dissertation in 1957, that people actually forego profits to cater their prejudice. The 2 have very different policy implications, but it's very hard when you look at mounds and mounds of data. Nearly impossible, if not impossible, to determine why is that discrimination occurring. In a field experiment, you can do that. What we found is that animus now is becoming much less important than it was years ago, and 3rd-degree price discrimination is becoming more and more important. And in a world where everyone has our data, this is very dangerous because what you need to do 3rd-degree price discrimination is essentially information that helps you explore or understand a person's willingness to pay function. That's exactly where we're going in society. Why do people give to charity? This has been an important question in my mind now for about 17 years. I've been doing field experiments with charitable organizations. And when I first got into that game, it was always about altruism. People give because they have an altruistic soul. That turns out to be much less important than good old selfishness. Many people give because it makes themselves feel good. What one of Scott's old colleagues, Jim Andreoni, called a warm glow effect. And Gary Becker also called it that in 1964 in one of his papers. Giving is primarily driven out of selfish reasons. Now, that's not a criticism of that sector. That sector turns out to be about 3% of GDP in the US. That's a statement that if we know that, now we can leverage that fact and raise more money for charitable organizations. That's why that result is important. Great big externalities. We all know, and this came up several times today in our conversations, one of the big problems we face is climate change, is citizenry. Now, where I've come at this question, that's a big, big question, so I narrow it down to something very narrow. And I say, how can I induce households to adopt green technologies? So in a very large-scale field experiment, what we do is we try to induce households to buy CFLs. And what we find is that social norms, i.e. telling people what their neighbors own in terms of CFLs or what people around the state own in terms of CFLs, is very effective to convince people to adopt for the very first time, what economists call the extensive margin. But social norms don't work very well after that first purchase. What works really well after that are prices. So if you want deeper penetration of CFLs, you can't continually use social norms. It has to be a complement in that you use social norms to start and you use prices to finish. And I think in many cases that involve social public goods, this will be true. In closing, let's think about how far economics has advanced in the last 20 years. So for this was my very first referee report in 1994. Here's what it said. This author clearly does not understand experimental economics, which is best done in the laboratory. I strongly advise rejecting this, quote, field experimental, quote, paper. That's 1994, my very first field experiment. Talk about a crushing experience. What am I doing here? I asked my wife. This was my most recent referee report that I received. This author performs a field experiment, which clearly is a preferred approach to answer questions within economics. That's a great, great change. But one thing that did not change is I still advise rejecting that paper. So some things will never change. I will always get my papers rejected. But nevertheless, I think people are at least open to using field experimentation in economics. I'm going to stop there and take any questions that you have. I'd like to say thank you very much for having me here. It's been just a delightful visit thus far. And everyone, thanks for coming, and I'll take any question that you might have now. Thanks.
As John said, we do have about 15 minutes for questions, but I will say I think maybe you now believe Kim when he says this stuff really can change the world. And if this wasn't inspiring on many dimensions, I don't know what it is. So please, if there's any questions, just raise your hand. We have some microphones here and available for people. So, yeah. These are the mic blockers around.
Hi, Dr. List.
Hi.
Question pertaining to healthcare. How would you, just a little background, previous study came out this week in Canada suggesting that the data obtained on health in Canada has been skewed by people lying. How would you suggest setting up an experiment to alleviate that kind of an issue and have people actually give honest answers to it?
Yeah, so there is an approach I did actually an old study on cocaine use, and not that I was interested in it as a consumer, but as and what I ended up using when I did that study was what was called the randomized response approach, where you essentially tell a person to flip a coin, maybe 3 times, and if it comes up heads all 3 times, answer the question honestly, and if it doesn't come up heads all 3 times, just circle yes. And then that's a way to statistically give people cover without destroying any anonymity that they have. It's called randomized response approach. And what we found there is we knew the truth, and we found in that study that that can come pretty close to inducing people to tell the truth. Now, it's interesting that you ask about dishonesty, because lately I've become interested in the economics of dishonesty, in part because the UK government approached a team of us to talk about how they could get people to pay their taxes that they owed the UK government. And then there was a companion study where they want us to try to get back overpaid benefit monies that they've paid. This is in the spirit of dishonesty. And this has come up a few times today about people tend to be dishonest more often when they can hide under the fact that it's an omission rather than when it's an active commission. So we leverage that simple thing in that experiment, and we find that when you have an umbrella of omission, that treatment brings in about 550,000 pounds in a 30-day period. But when we make that active omission an active commission by saying in the past, we've just thought that you didn't realize you owed us money, but now if you don't act, we will take it as an action not to repay what you owe us. That actually more than doubles the repayment rate in a 30-day period back to the UK government. So I think that's a psychological way to think about using behavioral economics, say, to change people's behaviors. Another way is to simply set up the economic incentives to have them tell the truth. So to think about incentive-compatible mechanisms in which you can use economic incentives to get people to tell the truth. So we have a series of studies now where we look at, there's this puzzle in the literature about why men lie more than women. That's sort of a stylized fact in that literature. So we brought parents and their 3, 4, or 5-year-olds into the lab and gave parents a game in which they could earn money, but if they lied about the outcome, which the kid could clearly see the outcome, they would earn more money. And what we find is that parents lie more in front of their sons than in front of their daughters. So then to close the loop, we say that it's at least suggestive that this difference out here is because, again, my mentors have just shown me it's okay to lie if you can benefit from it. So it's kind of a long-winded answer to, I would start with a randomized response, and then I would go to think about the psychology behind it, and then some incentive-compatible mechanism. Thanks. Here comes a tough, that was a super-duper tough question. Here comes a super-duper-duper tough question.
So I was wondering, with your result in the beginning about being paid off in the beginning and then having the chance of losing it, have people done that with grades? Like you give everyone in the class an A and then say, that's how we start. Yeah. And then you can lose it, but if you maintain above 85 and all these things, you keep it.
Absolutely.
Have people tried that out?
Yeah. So let me tell you about what people have tried, and I'll tell you about an ongoing study that you're thinking about. So I've done this kind of study now, the clawback, in a Chinese manufacturing plant. I've done it on farms in the Midwest. We've done it in the lab, and each time you get this clawback. Now, the next question along that dimension is, but do people actually like the clawback? So a lot of economists think about this in terms of welfare. Is this making the world truly a better place? It might not be if you make some kids better, but the teachers want to scratch their eyes out and they leave the school district and become sewer dwellers, for example. So we have this 5-year study now going on where people are part of that incentive scheme, And then they go back home. These are summer jobs in the Midwest. This is around Madison, Wisconsin on farms, where they shuck corn for us under one scheme. They leave, and then they come back the next summer, and we allow them to choose which payment scheme they want. And fewer people do like the clawback. So it's possible that it's welfare destroying. Now, to come back to your question, I presented that result in front of a group of education specialists in Chicago about a year ago, and two of them jumped up and said, I'm going to do that experiment that you just explained. And I still have not gotten the results from them, but the prediction will be kids will try harder. Now you have to think about, what are the outcomes that I'm going to measure in this experiment? Because if I just do grades, first of all, if grades are curved, then you're in trouble anyway. But if you just do grades, you have to make sure you take the teacher out of it, because the teacher in that case is not blind to treatment. So what you have to actually do is have some kind of effort logs or some such, where you can look at some real inputs and see if that approach, which I think that approach will work, by the way, but I'd like to know exactly why it works, and it has to be something outside of the teacher's influence for outcome measures. It could be a standardized test score, could be hours spent studying, it could be some other means, but you can't have the infiltration of the teacher in there. And I don't know if those two people who jumped up and said, I'm going to do this, my guess is they're just doing it in their own class, and then it's hard to interpret that result. But when you think about that clawback, that should be, in general, a very useful tool to use to induce effort. I do it with some editors right now. I don't want to tell the editors, but I incent some editors by giving them money up front, and then if their decision time takes too long, I take money away from them for an academic journal. But we shouldn't mention that here in this close circles. You should turn off the camera, please.
I actually have one.
Sure, go ahead.
I'll speak very loudly. I have a pretty good lecture room voice. I'm wondering about sort of how transferable some of these insights are. I mean, I think there are some common threads. You talked about loss aversion, for example, but you also alluded at several times to sort of the societal, cultural / context matters as well. Like sometimes money can make a difference, but then it matters how it's framed. I sometimes worry that people take some, whether it's in economics or other places, experiments, field experiments, and then sort of take a big leap to apply it to something that maybe isn't appropriate. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
No, I have a lot of thoughts on that. So my thoughts first started when I was thinking about lab experiments and the external validity or generalizability of lab experiments. And from there, what I learned very quickly was that representativeness of the population is much less important than representativeness of the situation for many types of games or activities that we have people play in the lab. And I think that same general result holds when you talk about generalizing from one field setting to another. Now that holds whether it's a field experiment or whether I'm beating up mounds and mounds of data. I think what we do less of is model the important properties of the situation, and then you think about the properties of the situation in distant markets that you want to generalize to, and adjust based on those properties. So theory is now starting along that dimension. I wrote a paper with Steve Levitt that was published in 2007 in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, where we start to do that along the lines of social preferences. And we start to think about what are the properties of the situation that might affect the social preferences that people exhibit. And then we say, if those properties are outside in the same way that they're inside the experiment, we can be confident that we can generalize. But it's always generalizing through the lens of a model. It's the model and the model's parameters that are more easily generalizable than the actual data. And that's always been my sense, is that a good field experiment starts with a good theory. You then run some randomized set of treatments that helps inform you about the theory, which parts we should reject, which parts we should keep, which parts we can generalize. And then you generalize the theory, not necessarily the data. And I think that's just my feeling on all empiricism, whether it's across time or across space or across environments. Okay. Go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
So I was kind of wondering about the education experiment. A few TED Talks I've been looking at, and just recently, we're seeing that formal education, it has a different place in the real world aspect as it does now. Do you think, would you have considered for your experiment just students in high school, what their perception of formal education would be, and the application of that in terms of how successful they'd be with it? So
Now, what the perception of, I missed the next one, perception
So,
of?
essentially, I mean, math and sciences have its place. That's why we're all here. However, things like budgeting, starting a business, applicable resources that we need to actually do well, not just as employees, but hopefully somebody who'd be able to
absolutely.
benefit society. How are you finding in those subject groups? How are they perceiving what the formal education system is?
Yeah, so I think the idea of tracking and when you should start tracking people, I think is a really interesting question. So I know the Dutch system the best outside the US, where they start tracking kids at a pretty early age. And then if they're late bloomers, they have to take an extra year of school to be able to go to college. But the people who stay on their same track in high school end up learning tasks that can make them productive members of the society, rather than learning about Aristotle, for example, or reading the y-axis or something like that. So I don't have a strong opinion on tracking, but what I do know is that once a student reaches the 9th grade, if they're in the range where most of my kids are in Chicago Heights, I think the best way forward is a tracking system, because they're so far behind where they need to be. And the tracking system then ends up giving them classes that they can actually excel in and understand the value of those classes. Because I think a ton of why people drop out is they don't see the value in education. It's just like what I talked about earlier. It's cost right now, and it's benefits far into the future. So if those benefits are ambiguous, or if I have a certain time discount trajectory, the best thing to do is drop out. What we do as good parents is we try to convince them that the best thing for you is to stay in school, because you're going to earn 12% more every year you stay in school, etc. Tell a Chicago Heights kid that. First of all, they don't believe you. And secondly, a ton of them are ambiguity averse. So they see this as a very uncertain game, and a game that they really don't want to commit a lot of effort in when they're really uncertain about the payoffs. So something that we've been talking about doing on that front, if you want to get them to go to college, is to actually take their extra earnings later in life, bring it back to when they're in 9th grade, pay them that money, and tell them, you will pay me back after you start your job after college. So it's budget neutral, and it takes care of the ambiguity aversion problem by you taking the risk. Some of them will drop out and they'll spend some of your money. But you give them an allowance every month from that account, so you're taking future money that you're confident they will earn and bringing it to the present. So we're starting that experiment right now. So if I get invited back, what would it be? 8 years later, I'll probably have results on that in 8 years. That seems to be my trajectory, to come back here every 6, 7, 8 years. Okay, does that help?
Absolutely. Thank
Great.
you.
Great, thanks.
Okay, we'll take one more. Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm interested in the parental academy that you were doing, and I'm wondering if you found a lot of success with the parent academy, and then if by extension you think there's value in having parents take a more formal role in their children's education.
Oh, absolutely. So the second one's a no-brainer. And that is true across the classes of people, across the income distribution. Now, the Parent Academy ended up being extremely empowering, because many parents want their kids to succeed. They just don't know how to do it. They don't know how to do it because they themselves have not gone through the process. And some of them do know how to do it, but they have to work 3 jobs because dad's gone, I'm living with grandmother and mom's never around because she has to supply resources for the family. So it ends up that by doing this Parent Academy, you're doing two very important things. One, you're giving them the tools to be a good parent and work with their children. And two, you're alleviating the budget constraint. So now within that Parent Academy, what I didn't talk about is there are two arms. One arm actually pays parents in cash every time they attend, and we pay them for performance of themselves and their children. They can earn up to $8,000 a year. There's another treatment where we put that money in a college tuition fund. And we tell them, when your child goes to school, you can draw down that fund. And what we've seen now is that right away for the cash, parents in the Parent Academy try a lot harder in the first one. But after their child leaves the program, those parents don't have as much of an incentive as the second set of parents have who have the money in a college tuition fund. So those parents continue to invest. So that's sort of the idea about if you give parents an incentive to invest over the entire life cycle, do they indeed invest? So to answer your question now, where we get the big result there is with Hispanic families, and I think a ton of that is because they have the family network set up. And they're in place already, and that's the norm for those types of families. And now that leads to just great policy implications about what we should be doing for those types of families in linking parent academies with things like EITC credit and stuff. Okay, does that help? Great, thanks a lot for your question. I want to say thanks again for having me.
Just three more things. Number one, if you'll join me again to thank John List for a fascinating lecture, please. Thank you very much. I'll also remind you that there is a reception. Unfortunately, it's by invitation only, and basically faculty and staff and invited people. So that follows as well. And yet, one more thing is we actually have a bit of a surprise for you today. Is we're having a bit of a lottery here. Unfortunately, it's not quite a field experiment, but it's getting there. So. One of the books that John is well known for is a popular book he's written. I know the close form by heart, but there's a semicolon, or a colon that I have to. So it's called The Y-Axis, Y as in W-H-Y, and also as in Y as the Y-axis, so a clever play on words. Hidden motives in the undiscovered economics of everyday life. And what we've done is under 10 randomly selected chairs that you are sitting on, there is an envelope that looks like this. And in that, it will tell you whether or not you